Part I. The present. 11. Modern Freemasonry. In the foregoing portion of this book we have followed the history of Freemasonry in the past and the various interpretations that have been placed on its rites and ceremonies. The question now arises, what is the role of Freemasonry today? The fundamental error of most writers on this question, whether Masonic or anti-Masonic, is to represent all Freemasons as holding a common belief and animated by a common purpose. Thus on one hand the panegyrics by Freemasons on their order as a whole, and on the other hand the sweeping condemnations of the order by the Catholic Church, are equally at fault. The truth is that Freemasonry in a generic sense is simply a system of binding men together for any given purpose, since it is obvious that allegories and symbols, like the X and Y of algebra, can be interpreted in 100 different manners. Two pillars may be said to represent strength and stability, or man and woman, or light and darkness, or any other two things we please. A triangle may signify the Trinity, or liberty, equality, and fraternity, or any other triad. To say that any of these symbols have an absolute meaning is absurd. The allegories of Freemasonry are equally capable of various interpretations. The building of the Temple of Solomon may signify the progress of any undertaking and Hiram the victim of its opponents. So also with regard to the secret tradition of Freemasonry concerning a loss which has befallen humanity, and its ultimate recovery. Any body of people working for an object may be said to have experienced a loss and to aim at its recovery. In the same way the whole organization of Freemasonry, the plan of admitting candidates to successive degrees of initiation, of binding them to secrecy by fearful oaths, is one that can be employed for any purpose, social, political, philanthropic, or religious, for promoting that which is good or for disseminating that which is evil. It may be used to defend a throne or to overthrow it, to protect religion or to destroy it, to maintain law and order or to create anarchy. Now, there was, as we have seen, from the beginning, besides the written charges, an oral tradition in Masonry, after the manner of the Kabbalah, on which the guidance of the society depended. The true character of any form of Freemasonry is thus not to be judged only by its printed ritual, but by the oral instruction of the initiates and the interpretations placed on the symbols and ritual. Naturally these interpretations vary in different countries and at different periods. Freemasonry is described in its ritual as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. But what code of morality? In studying the history of the order we shall find that the same code was by no means common to all Masonic bodies, nor is it today. Some maintain a very high standard of morals, others appear to possess no standard at all. Mr. Waite observes that, the two doctrines of the unity of God and the immortality of the soul constitute the philosophy of Freemasonry. But these doctrines are by no means essential to the existence of Freemasonry. The Grand Orient has renounced both, but it still ranks as Freemasonry. M. Paulnison is therefore perfectly right in saying, there are as many Masonries as countries, there is no such thing as universal Masonry. Broadly, however, modern Freemasonry may be divided into two kinds: the variety worked in the British Empire, in America, Holland, Sweden, Denmark, etc. and Grand Orient Masonry, which prevails in Catholic countries and of which the most important center is the Grand Orient of Paris. Continental Masonry. The fact that Masonry in Protestant countries is neither revolutionary nor anti-religious is frequently used by Catholic writers to show that Protestantism identifies itself with the aims of Masonry, and by Freemasons to prove that the tyranny of the Church of Rome has driven Masonry into an attitude hostile to church and state. The point overlooked in both these contentions is the essential difference in the character of the two kinds of Masonry. If the Grand Orient had adhered to the fundamental principle of British Masonry not to concern itself with religion or politics, there is no reason why it should have come into conflict with the Church. But its duplicity on this point is apparent. Thus in one of its earlier manuals it declares, like British Masonry, that it never interferes with questions of government or of civil and religious legislation, and that whilst making its members participate in the perfecting of all sciences, it positively accepts in the lodges two of the most beautiful, politics and theology, because these two sciences divide men and nations which Masonry constantly tends to unite. But on a further page of the same manual from which this quotation is taken we find it stated that Masonry is simply the political application of Christianity. Indeed, during the last 50 years the Grand Orient has thrown off the mask and openly declared itself to be political in its aims. In October 1887 the Venerable Bro. Blanc said in a discourse which was printed for the lodges, "You recognize with me, my brothers, the necessity for Freemasonry to become a vast and powerful political and social society having a decisive influence on the resolutions of the Republican government." And in 1890 the Freemason Ferdinand Maurice declared that nothing should happen in France without the hidden action of Freemasonry, and, if the Masons choose to organize, in 10 years' time no one in France will be able to move outside us, personne n'y bagarre plus en France en dehors de nous. This is the despotic power which the Grand Orient has established in opposition to both church and government. Moreover, Grand Orient Masonry is not only political but subversive in its political aims. Instead of the peaceful trilogy of British Masonry, brotherly love, relief, and truth, it has throughout adhered to the formula which originated in the Masonic lodges of France and became the war cry of the Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. It is the law of equality, says Regan, that has always endeared Masonry to the French, and, as long as equality really exists only in the lodges, Masonry will be preserved in France. The aim of Grand Orient Masonry is thus to bring about universal equality as formulated by Robespierre and Babeuf. In the matter of liberty we read further that as men are all by nature free, the old fallacy of Rousseau and of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, therefore, no one is necessarily subjected to another nor has the right to rule him. The revolutionary expresses the same idea in the phrase that, no man should have a master. Finally, by fraternity Grand Orient Masonry denotes the abolition of all national feeling. It is to Masonry, Regan says again, that we owe the affiliation of all classes of society. It alone could bring about this fusion which from its midst has passed into the life of the peoples. It alone could promulgate that humanitarian law of which the rising activity, tending to a great social uniformity, leads to the fusion of races, of different classes, of morals, codes, customs, languages, fashions, money, and measures. Its virtuous propaganda will become the humanitarian law of all consciences. The policy of the Grand Orient is thus avowedly international socialism. Indeed, in a further passage Regan plainly indicates this fact. Every generous reform, every social benefit derives from it, and if these survive it is because Masonry lends them its support. This phenomenon is due only to the power of its organization. The past belongs to it and the future cannot escape from it. By its immense lever of association it alone is able to realize by a productive communion generatrice, that great and beautiful social unity conceived by Jaurès, Saint-Simon, Owen, Fourier. If Masons wish it, the generous conceptions of these philanthropic thinkers will cease to be vain utopias. Who are the philanthropic thinkers enumerated here but the men derisively described by Karl Marx as the utopian socialists of the 19th century? Utopian socialism is thus simply the open and visible expression of Grand Orient Freemasonry. Moreover, these utopian socialists were almost without exception Freemasons or members of other secret societies. The Freemason Clavel confirms the foregoing account by Regan. Thus, like Regan, he quotes the principle expressed in a ritual for the initiation of a Master Mason. It is expressly forbidden to Masons to discuss amongst themselves, either in the lodge or outside it, religious and political matters, these discussions having usually the effect of creating discord where formerly peace, union, and fraternity reigned. This Masonic law admits of no exceptions. But Clavel also goes on to say, to efface amongst men the distinctions of color, rank, creed, opinions, country, to annihilate fanaticism, and the scourge of war, in a word, to make of the whole human race one and the same family united by affection, by devotion, by work and knowledge, that, my brother, is the great work which Freemasonry has undertaken, etc. Up to a point many a British Freemason reading these passages will declare himself completely in accord with the sentiments expressed. Humanitarianism, the obliteration of class distinctions, fraternization between men of all races, conditions, and religious creeds, enter of course largely into the spirit of British Masonry, but form simply the basis on which Masons meet together in the lodges and not a political system to be imposed on the world in general. British Masonry thus makes no attempt to interfere with the existing social system or form of government. The essence of its teaching is that each member of the fraternity should seek to reform himself and not society. In a word, individual regeneration takes the place of the social reorganization advocated by the Grand Orient under the influence of Illuminism. The formula of the United States of Europe, and of the Universal Republic, first proclaimed by the Illuminatus, Anacharsis Cloots, has long been the slogan of the French lodges. In the matter of religion, Grand Orient Masonry has entirely departed from the principle laid down by the British lodges. If the Catholic Church has shown itself hostile to Masonry, it must be remembered that in Catholic countries Masonry has shown itself militantly anti-Catholic. Freemasonry, one of its modern orators declared, is the anti-church, the anti-Catholicism, the church of heresy, la contre-église, la contre-Catholicism, l'église de l'HRC. The Bulletin of the Grand Orient in 1885 officially declared, we Freemasons must pursue the definite demolition of Catholicism. But the Grand Orient goes further than this and attacks all forms of religion. Thus, as has been said, those ancient landmarks of British Masonry, belief in the great architect of the universe and in the immortality of the soul, had never formed an integral part of its system, and it was only in 1849 that for the first time, it was distinctly formulated that the basis of Freemasonry is a belief in God and in the immortality of the soul, and the solidarity of humanity. But in September 1877 the first part of this formula was deleted, all allusions to the great architect were omitted, and the statute now reads, its basis is absolute liberty of conscience and the solidarity of humanity. British Freemasonry, which does not admit liberty of conscience in the sense of atheism, but demands that every Mason should profess belief in some form of religion and which insists that the volume of the sacred law in England the Bible, in Mohammedan countries the Quran, and so on should be placed on the table in its lodges, thereupon broke off all relations with the Grand Orient. In March 1878 the following resolution was passed unanimously. That the Grand Lodge, whilst always anxious to receive in the most fraternal spirit the brethren of any foreign Grand Lodge whose proceedings are conducted according to the ancient landmarks of the order, of which a belief in TGAOTU is the first and most important, cannot recognize as true and genuine brethren any who have been initiated in lodges which either deny or ignore that belief. The Grand Orient, says M. Copin Albansley, not content with renouncing the great architect whose glory it had celebrated on every possible occasion and whose praises had been incessantly sung in its lodges, demanded of its initiates that they should declare themselves to be absolutely convinced that the great architect was nothing but a myth. More than this, violent anti-religious tirades have been permitted and even applauded in the lodges. Thus in 1902 the Freemason Delch in his discourse at a Masonic banquet uttered these words. The triumph of the Galilean has lasted 20 centuries, he is dying in his turn. The mysterious voice which once on the mountains of Ypres announced the death of Pan, today announces the death of the deceiver God who had promised an era of justice and peace to those who should believe in him. The illusion has lasted very long, the lying God in his turn disappears, he goes to rejoin in the dust of ages the other divinities of India, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, who saw so many deluded creatures throw themselves at the foot of their altars. Freemasons, we are pleased to state that we are not unconcerned with this ruin of false prophets. The Roman Church, founded on the Galilean myth, began to decline rapidly on the day when the Masonic Association was constituted. From the political point of view, Freemasons have often varied. But in all times Freemasonry has stood firm on this principle: war on all superstitions, war on all fanaticism. How is it possible to reconcile this attitude towards religion in general and Christianity in particular with the fact that the Grand Orient still works the Rose-Croix degree? This degree, which, as we have seen, was first devised, whether in Scotland or in France, to give a Christian meaning to Masonry, was only incorporated into British Freemasonry in 1846 and in our country has retained its original character. Its ritual, centering around a lost word, signifies that the Old Testament dispensation has come to an end with the crucifixion, and is so strongly Christian that no Jew, Mohammedan, or other non-Christian can be admitted to it. Moreover, since this degree, known as the 18th degree, forms in reality the first degree of the ancient and accepted rite, as worked in this country, non-Christians are excluded from the whole of this rite and can only take the degrees of Royal Arch, Mark Mason, Royal Arch Mariner, and finally Royal Select and Super Excellent Master. Consequently, the 33 Masons of the 33rd degree who compose the Supreme Council which directs the ancient and accepted rite are necessarily professing Christians. Exactly the opposite is the case in France. The Rose-Croix, worked by professing atheists and Jews, can only be parody of Christian mysteries. Now, it is essential to realize that in France the anti-Masonic camp is divided into two parties. Whilst the majority of Catholic writers regard Freemasonry itself as the source of all evil, the synagogue of Satan, more impartial investigators have pronounced the opinion that it is not Freemasonry even of the Grand Orient variety but something concealed behind Freemasonry which constitutes the principal danger. This view is expressed by M. Copin Albansley, whose book Le Pouvoir Occulte contre la France is of the utmost importance to an understanding of the Masonic danger, for here there can be no question of Catholic prejudice or of imaginary accusations made by a stranger to Masonry. M. Copin Albansley entered the Grand Orient as an agnostic and has never returned to the bosom of the Church, yet as a Frenchman, a patriot, and a believer in law, morality, and Christian ethics he found himself obliged, after 6 years' experience in the lodges and after attaining the degree of Rose-Croix, to leave Freemasonry and, further, to denounce it. From what he himself heard and observed, M. Copin Albansley declares the Grand Orient to be anti-patriotic, subversive of all morality and religious belief, and an immense danger to France. But further than this, M. Copin Albansley declares the Grand Orient to be a system of deception by which members are enlisted in a cause unknown to themselves. Even the initiates of the upper degrees are not all aware of the real aim of the order or of the power behind it. M. Copin Albansley thus arrives at the conclusion that there are three Freemasonries, one above the other, i.e., Blue Masonry, that is the 3 craft degrees, in which none of the real secrets are revealed to the members and which serves merely as a sorting ground for selecting likely subjects. 2. The upper degrees, in which most of the members, whilst imagining themselves to have been initiated into the whole secret of the order and, bursting with importance, over their imaginary ala of leaders, are only admitted to a partial knowledge of the goal to which they are tending, and, 3. The inner circle, the true masters, those who conceal themselves behind high-grade masonry. Admission to this inner circle may be, moreover, not a matter of degrees, whilst in the lower masonries the adepts are obliged to pass through all the degrees of the established hierarchy. The upper and invisible Freemasonry is certainly recruited not only amongst the 33 degrees but in all the groups of upper degree masonry, and perhaps even in certain exceptional cases outside these. This inner and invisible Freemasonry is to a large extent international. The most illuminating passage in the whole of M. Copin Albansley's book is where he describes an experience that befell him after he had taken the degree of Rose Croix. It was then that one of his superiors took him aside and addressed him in the following terms. You realize the power which Freemasonry has at its disposal. We can say that we hold France. It is not because of our numbers, since there are only 25,000 Freemasons in this country. This was in 1889. Nor is it because we are the brains, for you have been able to judge of the intellectual mediocrity of the greater number of these 25,000 Freemasons. We hold France because we are organized and the only people who are organized. But above all, we hold France because we have a name. This aim is unknown. As it is unknown, no obstacle can be put in its way, and finally, as no obstacle is put up, the way is wide open before us. This is logical, is it not? Absolutely. Good. But what would you say of an association which instead of consisting of 25,000 non-entities as in Freemasonry, were composed of, say, only 1,000 individuals, but 1,000 individuals recruited in the manner that I will tell you? And the Freemason went on to explain the way in which such individuals were selected, the months and years of observation, of supervision, to which they were subjected, so as to form a body of picked men inside Freemasonry capable of directing its operations. You can imagine the power at the command of such an association? An association thus selected would do anything it chose. It could possess the world if it pleased. Thereupon the higher adept, after asking for a further promise of secrecy, declared, "Well, in exchange for this promise, Brother Copin, I am authorized to let you know that this association exists and that, further, I am authorized to introduce you into it." It was then that Monsieur Copin Albansley understood that the point to which the conversation was leading up was not, as he had at first supposed, an invitation to take the next step in Freemasonry, the 30th degree of Knight Kaddish, but to enter through a side door into an association concealed within Freemasonry and for which the visible organization of the latter served merely as a cover. A very curious resemblance will here be noticed between the method of sounding M. Copin Albansley and that of the Illuminatus Cato in the matter of Savioli, described in a passage already quoted. Now that he is a Mason I have taken up the general plan of our. And as this pleased him I said that such a thing really existed, whereat he gave me his word that he would enter it. M. Copin Albansley, however, did not give his word that he would enter it, but, on the contrary, checked further revelations by declaring that he would leave Freemasonry. This experience had afforded him a glimpse of a world existing behind the Masonic world, more secret than it, unsuspected by it as by the outside world. Freemasonry, then, can only be the half-lit antechamber of the real secret society. That is the truth. There exists then necessarily a permanent directing power. We cannot see that power, therefore it is occult. For some time M. Copin Albansley concluded this power to be the Jewish power, and elaborated the idea in a further work. But the war has led him to develop his theories in yet another book, which will shortly appear. That the lodges of the Grand Orient are largely controlled by Jews is, however, certain, and that they are centers of political propaganda is equally undeniable. We have only to glance at the following extracts, some of which are reproduced on the opposite page from the program of debates in the Bulletin of the Grand Orient for June 5, 1922. To recognize that the ideas they propagate are simply those of international socialism. Logue, Union et France, Lecture du rapport de notre T. C. F. Chardet zur l'exploitation des richesses nationales au profit de la collectivité. Logue, les innovateurs, exploitation des richesses nationales et des grosses entreprises and profit de la collectivité. Conférence de notre F. Goldschmidt, Orat. Adjoint zur Lemmy question. Illustration, newspaper clippings. Logue, Les aides les philanthropes, la transformation de la société actuelle s'impose TL. Conférence par le T. C. F. Edmond Gottin. Logue, Px travail solidarit, à la de la franquement honoré dans la politique actuelle, par le F. Logue, les Trinitaires, le socialisme France, par le T. Il. F. May. 10. Collective de L. Emmanuel Arago, les cœurs unis indivisibles, comment propager notre idéal unique dans la monde profane. Conference par la F. J. de la L. Isis Monthian. Logue, Isis Monthian et conscience et volonté, laterer et le péril fasciste en Italie, le fascisme et l'F questionnement. Italian, Impressions de notre F. Mazzini, de retour, et presson es jour prolong en Italie. It will be seen by the last of these extracts that Grand Orient Masonry is the enemy of fascismo, which saved Italy in her hour of peril. Indeed, the Italian Masons passed a resolution which was directly opposed to fascist views, especially with regard to the religious policy of Mussolini, who has restored the crucifix to the schools and religious teaching to the curriculum. The fascist Giornale di Roma declared that the principles announced by the Masons in this resolution were those which threatened to submerge the state and nation. Consequently, Mussolini declared that fascisti must either leave their lodges or leave fascismo. In Belgium, Freemasonry has taken the same political and anti-religious course. In 1856 the directing committee of the Belgian Grand Orient declared, not only is it the right but the duty of the lodges to supervise the actions in public life of those amongst its members whom it has placed in political posts. The right to demand explanations. When in 1866 at a funeral ceremony in honor of the deceased King Leopold I, the Grand Orient of Belgium displayed the maxim, "The soul which has emanated from God is immortal," the Freemasons of Louvain entered a violent protest on the ground that free thinking had been admitted by the Belgian lodges in 1864 as its fundamental principle, and that the Grand Orient had therefore violated the convictions of its members. In Spain and Portugal, Freemasonry has played not merely a subversive but an actively revolutionary and sanguinary role. The anarchist Ferrer, intimately concerned with a plot to murder the King of Spain, was at the same moment entrusted with negotiations between the Grand Orient of France and the Grand Lodge of Catalonia. These murderous schemes, frustrated in Spain, met, however, in Portugal with complete success. The Portuguese revolutions from 1910 to 1921 were organized under the direction of Freemasonry and the secret society of Carbonarios. The assassination of King Carlos and his elder son had been prepared by the same secret organizations. In 1908 a pamphlet modeled on the libels published against Marie Antoinette was directed against Queen Amélie and her husband. A month later the assassination took place. Amongst the leaders of the new republic was Miguel Lima, Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Portugal. The authorship of these disorders was, in fact, so clearly recognized that honest Freemasons forsook the lodges. An English Mason, unaware of the true character of Portuguese Freemasonry, when in Lisbon in August 1919, made himself known to several moderate Portuguese Masons, who, while glad to welcome him as a brother, refused to take him to a lodge, declaring that they had severed all connection with Masonry since it had passed under the control of assassins. They also added that the assassination of Seixas, the president in December 1918, was the work of certain Portuguese lodges. A special meeting had previously been held in Paris in conjunction with the Grand Orient of France, at which it had been decided that Ps was to be removed. This decision reached, the earliest opportunity of putting it into force was sought with fatal results. The assassin was imprisoned in the penitentiary but liberated by the revolution of 1921, and no attempt has been made to recapture him. The murder of Dr. Antonio Granjo in October 1921 was traced to the same agency. In the pocket of the murdered man was found a document from the Lodge of Liberty and Justice, warning him of the decision taken against him for having ordered the police to protect the British Tramway Company. The present Portuguese government, indeed, makes no secret of its Masonic character and prints the square and compass on its banknotes. But whilst in Spain and Portugal Freemasonry manifested itself in anarchist outrages, in the east of Europe the lodges, largely under the control of Jews, followed the line of Marxian socialism. After the fall of the Belakan regime in Hungary, a raid on the lodges brought to light documents clearly revealing the fact that the ideas of socialism had been disseminated by the Freemasons. Thus in the minutes of meetings it was recorded that on November 16, 1906, Dr. Callows had addressed the Jew Lodge on socialist ideals. The ideal world which we call the Masonic world, he declared, will be also a socialist world, and the religion of Freemasonry is that of socialism as well. Dr. Callows then proceeded to acquaint the members with the theories of Marx and Engels, showing that no help was to be found in utopias, as the interests of the proletarians were in absolute conflict with those of other classes, and these differences could only be settled by international class warfare. Nevertheless, with that fear of the proletariat which has always characterized the Democrats of revolutionary Freemasonry, Dr. Callows declared later that the social revolution must take place without bloodshed. The Karolyi regime was the direct outcome of these illusions, and as in all revolutions paved the way for the more violent elements. Still further east in Europe the lodges, though revolutionary, instead of following the international socialist line of Hungarian Freemasonry, exhibited a political and nationalist character. The Young Turk movement originated in the Masonic lodges of Salonika under the direction of the Grand Orient of Italy, which later contributed to the success of Mustafa Kemal. Moreover, as we approach the Near East, cradle of the Masonic system, we find the Semitic influence not only of the Jews but of other Semite races directing the lodges. In Turkey, in Egypt, in Syria now, as 1,000 years ago, the same secret societies which inspired the Templars have never ceased to exist, and in this mingling of the East and West it is possible that the Grand Orient may draw reinforcement from those sources whence it drew its system and its name. Amongst the strange survivals of early Eastern sects are the Druzes of Lebanon, who might indeed be described as the Freemasons of the East. Their outer organization closely resembles that of the craft degrees in Western Masonry, yet such is their power of secrecy that few if any Europeans have ever succeeded in discovering the secret doctrines. That their tendency is largely political admits of little doubt. In fact, men intimately acquainted with the Near East have declared that the influence they exercise over the politics of that region is as far-reaching as that of the Grand Orient over the affairs of Europe, and that they form the breeding ground of all political ideas and changes. Though small in numbers, this mysterious society is composed of past masters in the game of intrigue, who, whilst playing apparently a minor part at political meetings, secret or otherwise, or even remaining completely silent, contrived to influence decisions with startling results. British Masonry. We shall now consider the further ways in which British Masonry differs from the Grand Orient. In the first place, whilst working the same degrees, its rituals, formulas, and ceremonies, as also the interpretation it places on words and symbols, are different in many essential points. Secondly, British Masonry is essentially an honest institution. Whereas in the Grand Orient the initiate is led through a maze of ceremonies towards a goal unknown to him which he may discover too late to be other than he supposed, the British initiate, although admitted by gradual stages to the mysteries of the craft, knows nevertheless from the beginning the general aim of the order. Thirdly, British Masonry is primarily philanthropic, and the sums it devotes to charitable purposes are immense. Since the war, the three principal Masonic charities have collected annually over £300,000. But the point to be emphasized here is that British Masonry is strictly non-political, not merely in theory but in practice, and that it enforces this principle on every occasion. Thus, before the recent general election, the report of the Board of General Purposes, drawn up by Grand Lodge on December 5, 1923, recalled to the notice of the craft that all subjects of a political nature are strictly excluded from discussion in Masonic meetings, this being in accordance with long-established Masonic tradition. It follows from this that Masonry must not be used for any personal or party purpose in connection with an election. It further emphasized the distinct caution, that any attempt to bring the craft into the electioneering arena would be treated as a serious Masonic offense. At the same time a fresh injunction was made with regard to the Grand Orient of France. As recognition was withdrawn from that body by the United Grand Lodge of England in 1878. It is considered necessary to warn all members of our lodges that they cannot visit any lodge under the obedience of a jurisdiction unrecognized by the United Grand Lodge of England, and further that under Rule 150 of the Book of Constitutions, they cannot admit visitors therefrom. For the reasons given at the beginning of this section, British Masonry stands rigidly aloof from all attempts to create an international system of Masonry. The idea was first suggested at the Masonic Congress of Paris in 1889, convened to celebrate the centenary of the First French Revolution, but led to nothing very definite until the Congress of Geneva in September 1902, at which the delegates of 34 lodges, Grand Orients, and Supreme Councils were present, and a proposal was unanimously adopted, tending towards the creation of an international bureau for Masonic affairs, to which 20 powers, mostly Europeans, gave their adherence. Brother Desmonds, of the Grand Orient of France, in an after-dinner speech declared it to have been always the dream of his life, that all democracies should meet and understand one another in such a way as one day to form the Universal Republic. According to the official report of the proceedings, the representatives of Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, England, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland greeted with much feeling the dawn of this new era. The same report goes on to observe that it is altogether a mistake to believe that Freemasonry does not attack the defects of such and such a state, and that consequently it remains a stranger to party strife and the tendencies of the times. And again, Freemasonry has imposed upon itself a task, a mission. It is a question of nothing less than the rebuilding of society on an entirely new basis, which shall be more in accordance with the present conditions of the means of communication, of situation, and production, as well as of a reform of right, of a complete renewal of the principle of existence, especially of the principle of community and of the relations of men among one another. The report here quoted is, however, inaccurate in one important particular. No English delegates were present at the Geneva Congress or on any other occasion of the kind. There was a delegate from Adelaide who spoke a good deal, but the chairman specifically mentioned England as taking no part in the movement. Later on, in a report of the Board of General Purposes to Grand Lodge on March 2, 1921, a letter from a Lord Ampthill, Pro-Grand Master, appears, declining an invitation from the Swiss Grand Lodge Alpina to British Freemasons to attend an international Masonic Congress in Geneva, and quoting the following letter from the Grand Secretary as an earlier precedent for this refusal. I am directed to state, in reply to the invitation to attend an international Masonic conference in Switzerland during the coming autumn, that the United Grand Lodge of England will be unable to send representatives on the occasion. It never participates in a Masonic gathering in which are treated as an open question what it has always held to be ancient and essential landmarks of the craft, these being an express belief in the great architect of the universe, and an obligatory recognition of the volume of the sacred law. Its refusal to remain in fraternal association with such sovereign jurisdictions as have repudiated or made light of these landmarks has long been upon record, and its resolve in this regard remains unshaken. Lord Ampthill then went on to say, a further consequence of certain happenings of the war is to make more firm our resolve to keep, as far as in us lies, Freemasonry strictly away from participation in politics, either national or international. This attitude of aloofness from necessarily controversial affairs of state, on which brethren can legitimately and most properly differ, has ever been maintained by our Grand Lodge since it was first convened in 1717. Because of this, it held aloof from such international conferences as were summoned during the war, and never more than now has the necessity for the maintenance of this attitude been felt by British Freemasons. For these reasons, the invitation to participate in the proposed International Conference of Freemasons at Geneva cannot be accepted. Such an assembly might be termed informal, but inevitably it would be regarded as opening a door to compromise on those things which this Grand Lodge has always held to be essentials. Such a compromise English Freemasonry will never contemplate. On these essentials we take the firm stand we have always done. We cannot detract from full recognition of the great architect of the universe, and we shall continue to forbid the introduction of political discussion into our lodges. British Masonry has thus taken a firm stand against the Grand Orient. But it is regrettable that views so admirably expressed should be confined to Masonic correspondence and not made more apparent to the world in general. On the continent, outside Masonic circles, the difference between British Masonry and the Grand Orient variety is not sufficiently known, and the reticence of leading British Masons on this subject has not only played into the hands of the intractable anti-Masons, who declare all Masonry to be harmful, but has strengthened the position of the revolutionaries who use Masonry for a subversive purpose. Thus in the Portuguese Revolution of 1920 the Masons of that country who were directing the movement sheltered themselves behind the good name of England. "How can you accuse the lodges of being murder clubs?" they said to the people, "when Masonry is directed by England and had King Edward for its Grand Master." However ludicrous all this may seem to the British public, yet for the honour of our country such accusations should not remain unrefuted. A witness of the disorders that took place in Portugal declared to the present writer that if only Grand Lodge of England would have published a notice in the continental press disassociating itself from the Grand Orient in general and from Portuguese Freemasonry in particular, the power of the revolutionaries would have been immensely weakened and the anti-British and pro-German propaganda then circulating in the country defeated. But British Freemasonry preferred to maintain an attitude of aloofness, contenting itself with issuing periodical warnings against the Grand Orient privately to the lodges. This policy has done much to damage not only the good name of England but of British Masonry in the eyes of the outside world, and particularly in those of Roman Catholics, which is the more regrettable since Freemasonry and the Roman Catholic Church are the only two organized bodies in this country which really exercise discipline over their members and forbid them to belong to subversive secret societies. Hence they provide the two strongest bulwarks against the occult forces of revolution. For this reason, as we shall see later, they are the two bodies which are the most feared by the recruiting agents of these societies. But in the case of Freemasonry the fact is unfortunately too little known to the world in general. As a singularly broad-minded Jesuit has recently expressed it, the anti-clerical and revolutionary activities of continental Freemasonry did not begin when the Grand Orient finally abolished God. During a century and more these evil forces had been at work. Nevertheless English Masons only shrugged their shoulders and looked another way, though the true character of foreign Masonry was brought to their notice in such books as that of John Robison, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe. No doubt, the same writer says again, there has been at times a deplorable amount of exaggeration among continental Catholics in attributing all the moral and social evils of the world to the insidious workings of Freemasonry. But so long as English Freemasons resolutely avert their gaze from the anti-religious and anti-social activities of their continental brethren there can be no hope of any better understanding. It is impossible to deny the truth of these strictures. As has already been pointed out in the course of this book, British Freemasons have frequently not only ignored Robison's warning but vilified him as the enemy of Masonry, although he never attacked their order but only the perverted systems of the continent. Too often also they have exonerated the most dangerous secret societies, notably the Illuminati, because, apparently from a mistaken sense of loyalty, they conceive it their duty to defend any association of Masonic character. This is simply suicidal. British Masonry has no bitterer enemies than the secret societies working for subversion, which, from the Illuminati onwards, have always regarded honest Masonry with contempt and used its doctrines for an ulterior purpose. It is easy to see how these doctrines may be perverted to an end directly opposed to that which British Masons have in view. Thus, for example, the idea of the brotherhood of man in the sense of love for all humanity is the essence of Christianity: be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. In adopting brotherly love as a part of their sacred trilogy, British Masons adopt an entirely Christian standpoint. But if by the brotherhood of man is meant that men of every race are equally related and that therefore one owes the same duty to foreigners as to one's fellow countrymen, it is obvious that all national feeling must vanish. The British Freemason does not, of course, interpret the theory in this manner. He cannot seriously regard himself as the brother of the Bambute Pygmy or the Polynesian cannibal, thus he uses the term merely in a vague and theoretical sense. What indeed does the word brother literally mean? If we consult the dictionary, we shall see it defined as a male born of the same parents, anyone closely united with or resembling one another, associated in common interests, occupation, etc. It is therefore obviously absurd to say that men of such different races as those referred to are brothers. They are not born of the same kind of parents, they are not united in their aims, they do not remotely resemble one another, and they are not associated in common interests and occupations. Though these happen to be extreme cases, there are nevertheless essential differences between men of the same zone and climate. The Englishman and the Frenchman are not brothers because they do not see life from the same point of view, but that is no reason why they should not be close allies. The brotherhood of man, if taken literally, is therefore a misleading term, nor is such a relationship necessary to the peace of the world. Cain and Abel were not better friends, for being brothers. David and Jonathan, on the other hand, were not brothers but devoted friends. In striving after universal brotherhood in a literal sense, Freemasons are therefore pursuing a chimera. The most dangerous fallacy to which democracy, under the influence of Illuminized Freemasonry, has succumbed is that peace between nations can be brought about by means of internationalism, that is to say, by the destruction of national feeling. Yet a man is not more likely to live at peace with his neighbors because he is devoid of natural affection. On the contrary, the good brother, the devoted father, is most likely to become the faithful friend. Permanent peace between nations will probably never be ensured, but the only basis on which such a situation can conceivably be established is the basis of sane nationalism and understanding between the patriotic and virile elements in every country which, because they value their own liberties and revere their own traditions, are able to respect those of other nations. Internationalism is an understanding between the decadent elements in each country, the conscientious objectors, the drawing-room socialists, the visionaries who shirk the realities of life and, as the socialist Karl Kautsky in a description of idealists has admirably expressed it, see only differences of opinion and misapprehension where there are actually irreconcilable antagonisms. This is why at times of crisis idealists are of all men the most dangerous and pacifists the great promoters of wars. Understanding between nations is wholly desirable, but the destruction of the national spirit everywhere can only lead to the weakening of all countries where this process takes place and the triumph of the nations who refuse to accept the same principle. It will perhaps be answered that Freemasons do not believe in the doctrine of brotherhood between all men, but only between Masons of all races. But this may lead no less to national disintegration if it creates a nation within each nation, an international fraternity independent of the countries to which its members belong. The logical outcome of this may be that a man will refuse to fight for his country against his brother Masons. It is what has happened in France. The Grand Orient was before the recent war the great breeding ground of anti-patriotism, where all schemes for national defense were discouraged. Before 1870 the same thing took place, and it was in the Masonic lodges that Germany found her most valuable allies. In the same way the doctrine of the perfectibility of human nature lends itself to perversion. Nothing could be more desirable than that man should strive after perfection. did not Christ enjoin his disciples, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect"? Man is therefore acting in accordance with Christian principles in seeking after divine perfection. But when he comes to believe that he has already attained it, he makes of himself a god. "If I justify myself," said Job, "mine own mouth shall condemn me. If I say I am perfect, it shall also prove me perverse." And St. John, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us." More than this, if we seek perfection in others, we deceive ourselves equally and make gods of men. This is precisely the conclusion at which perverted Freemasonry and the forms of socialism deriving from it arrive. Human nature, they say, is itself divine. What need then for other divinities? The Catholic Church is consequently quite right in declaring that the doctrine of the perfectibility of human nature leads to the deification of humanity, in that it puts humanity in the place of God. The Grand Orient, which definitely accepts this doctrine, has therefore logically erased the name of the great architect of the universe from its ritual and has become an association of freethinkers and atheists. Is it necessary to point out the folly as well as the crime of this delusion, the ludicrous inconsequence of men who divinize humanity yet revile what they call society? All the evils of the world, they declare, are not to be found in nature but in man-made laws, in the institutions of society. Yet what is society but the outcome of human wills, of human aspirations? Society may be, and no doubt is, in need of reformation, but are not its imperfections the creation of imperfect beings? It is true that today the world is in a state of chaos, industrial chaos, political chaos, social chaos, religious chaos. Everywhere men are losing faith in the causes they are supposed to represent, authority questions its own right to govern, democracy is rent with divisions, the ruling classes are abdicating in favor of unscrupulous demagogues, the ministers of religion barter their faith for popularity. And what has brought the world to this pass? Humanity. Humanity, that all-wise, all-virtuous abstraction that needs no light from heaven. Humanity that was to take the place of God. If ever there was a moment in the history of the world when the futility of this pretension should be apparent, it is the present moment. All the ills, all the confusion, what are they but the outcome of human error and of human passions? It is not capitalism that has failed, nor yet democracy, nor yet even socialism as a principle. It is not monarchy that has broken down, nor republicanism, nor again religion. It is humanity that has broken down. The ills of capitalism arise from the egoism of individual capitalists. Socialism has failed because, as Robert Owen discovered, the idle, the quarrelsome, the selfish have prevented its success. If men were perfect, socialism might succeed, but so might any other system. A perfect capitalist would love his employees himself, just as a perfect socialist would be willing to work for the common good. It is the imperfections of human nature that prevent, and will always prevent, any system from being perfect. There will never be a millennium of man's making. Only the application of Christian principles to human conduct can bring about a better order of things. Grand Orient Masonry, in deifying human nature, thus not only builds upon the sand, but by its rejection of all religion takes away the sole hope of human progress. Meanwhile, by the support it lends to socialism, it encourages the class war instead of the brotherhood between men of all ranks and conditions which it professes to advocate. British Freemasonry, on the other hand, whilst not interpreting brotherhood in a political sense, nevertheless contributes to social peace. At the annual conference of the Labour Party in 1923 a proposal was made by the extreme section that any person who is a Freemason should be excluded from any kind of office, it being suggested that, in cases where an understanding has been reached between trade union leaders and employers, thus preventing or limiting industrial trouble, the secret has been the bond of Freemasonry. Whether this was the case or not, British Masonry, by taking its stand on patriotism and respect for religion, necessarily tends to unite men of all classes and therefore offers a formidable bulwark against the forces of revolution. Any attacks on British Masonry as at present constituted and directed are therefore absolutely opposed to the interests of the country. But at the same time it behoves Masons to beware of the insidious attempts that are being made by irregular secret societies to infiltrate the craft and pervert its true principles. The present satisfactory condition of Freemasonry in England is owing not only to its established statutes, but to the character of the men who control it, men who are not, as in 18th century France, mere figureheads, but the real directors of the order. Should the control ever pass into the wrong hands and the agents of secret societies succeed in capturing a number of the lodges, this great stabilizing force might become a gigantic engine of destruction. How insidiously these efforts are being made we shall see in the next chapter.